Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Back to Basics. I continue to be Pastor Don. You can tell by the funny little thing on my neck here. It's really cool. It's awesome, which I am wearing today because I have a sermon recording I'm going to be doing later. So I have to actually look like a pastor for once in my life. So, I'm doing the thing. I am joined, however, by someone who also has some fancy neckwear, our wonderful, our beloved, our most famous and friendly Courtney Fraley.
Howdy. And I am wearing this because I'm actually repping my friend's obscure ska band. There you go.
Oh, that's cool. That is very cool.
Hi, Aaron. I don't think he watches the show. That's okay. I don't think many of my friends watch the show.
Well, we can fix that. Spread the gospel of things that we do, because that's how evangelicals work. Anyway, let's move on. We are getting into Genesis chapter 41, which is the continuation of the Joseph story. And as I may have mentioned several times, we're going to be dealing with our boy Joe for a while. So last episode, Joe boy was in prison and he interpreted some dreams and some folk died horrifically. And then everybody forgot that he existed. And that leads us to today's story, which we're going to start out with Genesis chapter 41. Now, I will warn you all of two things. One, this passage is going to be a bit of a long one, but it's mostly long because it's repetitive. Now, because I believe in the fullness of what we're doing, I'm going to read the whole damn thing. But if you need to be tapping that skip ahead 10 and you've got it up in front of you, go right ahead. No one's going to judge you for that. Second thing, I may be ranting a little bit more than usual because I know dear Courtney here is coming back from a bit of a cold, so I want to save her voice as much as possible because she's a good person and I like her.
And save their ears.
Also, I'm a pastor and I really love to talk, so it's not much of a sacrifice for me. Anyway,
I'm sure my thick Michigan accent annoys a certain percentage of our listeners.
I notice no accent. I see.
That's because you come from Michigan.
Oh, don't tell anybody. It's my secret. Anyway. Let's get started with Genesis chapter 41. Now, since I'm the one who's reading today, I'm going to do it in the stupid way. I'm going to read from Alter's translation because I like it better, and screw you if you don't. However, those of you who are reading along and playing the home game who don't have Alter's translation in front of you, which I assume is all of you, we will be reading out of the NRSVUE. Follow along, and if you spot the differences, like a highlights for children here, you might find some interesting things, or at least just pass the time until the dentist shows up, which I assume is what you're doing with YouTube anyway. So let's get started with Genesis chapter 41. And it happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and look, he was standing by the Nile. And look, out of the Nile came up 7 cows, fair to look at and fat in flesh, and they grazed in the rushes. And look, another 7 cows came up after them out of the Nile, foul to look at and meager in flesh, and stood by the cows on the bank of the Nile. And the foul-looking, meager-fleshed cows ate up the 7 fair-looking, fat cows, and Pharaoh awoke. And he slept and dreamed a second time. And look, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, fat and goodly. And look, 7 meager ears, blasted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the meager ears swallowed the 7 fat and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and look, it was a dream. And it happened in the morning that his heart pounded, and he sent and called in all the soothsayers of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh recounted to them his dreams, but none could solve them for Pharaoh. And the chief cupbearer spoke to Pharaoh, saying, "My offenses I recall today. Pharaoh had been furious with his servants, and he placed me under guard in the house of the high chamberlain, me and the chief baker. And we dreamed a dream on the same night, he and I. Each of us dreamed a dream with its own solution. And there was with us a Hebrew lad, a slave of the high chamberlain, and we recounted to him, and he solved our dreams. Each of us, according to his dream, he solved it. And it happened just as he had solved it for us. So it came about. Me he restored to my post, and him he impaled. And Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and they hurried him from the pit, and he shaved and changed his garments and came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I dreamed a dream, and none can solve it. And I have heard about you, that you can understand a dream to solve it. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, Not I. God will answer for Pharaoh's well-being. And Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, In my dream, here I was standing on the bank of the Nile, and look, out of the Nile came up 7 cows, fat in flesh and fair in feature, and they grazed in the rushes. And look, another 7 cows came up after them, gaunt and very foul-featured and meager in flesh, and I had not seen their like in all the land of Egypt for foulness. And the meager, foul cows ate up the first 7 fat cows, and they were taken into their bellies, and you could not tell that they had come into their bellies, for their looks were as foul as before. And I woke. And I saw in my dream, and look, 7 ears of grain came up on a single stalk, full and goodly. And look, 7 shriveled, meager ears, blasted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the meager ears swallowed the 7 goodly ears. And I spoke to my soothsayers, and none could tell me the meaning. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dream is one.
Soothsayers are terrible at dream interpretation.
Yes. Joseph said to Pharaoh, your soothsayers suck. Here's what really happened. Continuing. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dream is one. What God is about to do, he has told Pharaoh. The 7 goodly cows are 7 years, and the 7 ears of grain are 7 years. The dream is one. And the 7 meager and foul cows who come up after them are 7 years, and the 7 meager ears of grain blasted by the east wind will be 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, what God is about to do, he has shown Pharaoh. Look, 7 years are coming of great plenty through all the land of Egypt, and 7 years of famine will arise after them, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will ravage the land, and you will not be able to tell there was plenty in the land because of that famine afterwards, for it will be very grave. And the repeating of the dream to Pharaoh 2 times, this means that the thing has been fixed by God, and God is hastening to do it. And so let Pharaoh look out for a discerning, wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Appoint overseers for the land and muster the land of Egypt in the 7 years of plenty. And let them collect all the food of these good years that are coming, and let them pile up grain under Pharaoh's hand, food in the cities to keep under guard. And the food will be a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine, which will be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish in the famine. And the thing seemed good in Pharaoh's eyes and in the eyes of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, could we find a man like him in whom is the Spirit of God? And Pharaoh said to Joseph, Pharaoh, sorry. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, after God has made known to you all this, there is none as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and by your lips all my folk shall be guided. By the throne alone shall I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and had him clothed in fine linen clothes, and placed the golden collar around his neck. And he had him ride in the chariot of his viceroy, and they called out for him, Abrech, setting him over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh. Without you, no man shall rise hand or foot in all the lands of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife. And Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and passed through all the lands of Egypt. And the land in 7 years of plenty made gatherings. And he collected all the food of the 7 years that were in the land of Egypt, and he placed food in the cities. The food from the fields round each city he placed within it. And Joseph piled up grain like the sand of the sea, very much until he ceased counting, for it was beyond count. And to Joseph 2 sons were born before the coming of the year of famine, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore him. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, meaning God has released me from all the debt of my hardship and of all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, meaning God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And the 7 years of plenty that had been in the land of Egypt came to an end. And the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said, and there was famine in all the lands. But in the land of Egypt there was bread. And all the land of Egypt was hungry, and the people cried out to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to all of Egypt, go to Joseph. What he says to you, you must do. And the famine was over all the land, and Joseph laid open whatever had grain within, and sold provisions to Egypt. And the famine grew harsh in the land of Egypt, and all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to get provisions, for the famine had grown harsh in all the earth. Thus endeth the very long reading.
Does grain stay good for 7 years?
think so. I mean, grain, I know like rice, once you've bagged it up and secured it, can last for a long time, provided it's kept in a cool, dry place and you keep bugs from it. Grain is of a similar structure to rice. So, like, I mean, I'm not an expert in food keeping to that extent, but I assume so.
Just something that my brain just hung on to, like, no, I need to know this.
Yeah.
We should look it up or something. But I always have these weird, like, cultural and continuity questions, and you're
Oh
like,
yeah.
that's not the point of what we're doing here. I
And
think
we have
it's part of the point.
and I think we have established too that despite being the origin of the word canon, the Bible doesn't exactly keep a canon continuity here on a lot of things. It's not meant to. It's not supposed to. That's not how it works. So yeah, it's meant to tell a larger story. Maybe grain probably, I don't know, wouldn't keep for 7. I don't know. It doesn't really matter to the story.
No, for the purposes of the story, it does. Yeah.
For the purposes of the story, grain can keep for at least 7 years. Actually, closer to 14. But I don't actually know if it would do that.
For depends on if they're doing first in, first out. But if they're just piling it up, no, by the end it'd be 14-year-old grain.
What you do is you create a big old tower and you put a spigot on the bottom and you dump the grain in when it comes in. And every time you need grain, you put it out the bottom. As long as you're putting in more than you take out, it should stay fresh for somewhat longer.
Are you arguing that Joseph was using silo technology in ancient Egypt?
Oh, I mean, maybe his silo was shaped like a pyramid, but what the hell do I know?
They say outright in big piles. I'm sorry, I know that's not important. It's what my brain has decided to toy with.
Yeah.
So what do you want to talk about this?
Well, I mean,
Mr.
this is
Preacher Man with your fancy collar.
yeah, despite the fact that this is a long ass passage, there's not a lot interpretively, at least, that is here that isn't straightforward.
Yeah.
Like in the notes, we get like reminders of things like, yeah, the dude was definitely impaled and whatnot, but you looked like you had a question. What was that?
Oh, yeah. No, I was just remembering I butted in while you were reading to get snark about it, but like were his dream interpreters just really shitty? Or is it like fairly obvious for the purposes of the story what the meaning of those dreams are? Because I'm like, this seems kind of weirdly straightforward.
Well, we're going to run into this theme again and again and again and again throughout the Bible, is the emphasis on the servants of God being better at the metaphysical than anyone else. Now, I know evangelicals tend to take this to mean that, yeah, all the soothsayers and whatnot, they were just BS con artists who were, convincing Pharaoh that they could do shit to have a job. And when actually called upon to do the thing, oh, yeah, we don't actually know what we're doing. But maybe not. But I would present this more along the lines as your soothsayers were maybe servants of other gods, little g, whatever they were, magicians, what have you. But what made Joseph unique is that in the service of capital G God, he's connected to something that transcends the boundaries of time. So his soothsaying is less reading the bones or, reading the signs of the present in order to interpret the future, but more of connecting what he's already been given with a trans-temporal perspective. That'd be my take on it, but I don't know.
No, I mean, I'm just saying, I don't think you have to have a trans-universal connection to interpret those dreams as someone even remotely interested in that sort of thing.
Right. And like again, it's worth mentioning that this is a story that is written for a purpose. And like the original oral tradition of these stories, like being read around campfires and what have you, like 7,000-8,000 years ago, is that all the little kiddos and young ones around the fireplace, I know what that dream means. I know what that dream means. Those soothsayers, they don't know as much as the children of God. Like it was kind of meant to engender a little bit of that. So
okay.
So
right.
like narratively in
so
terms
I was like,
of
none of them? I think you're the Pharaoh. You should have access to a ridiculous number of soothsayers, and none of them could interpret your dream.
Yeah, it does seem pretty obvious. Yeah. I would imagine then
So yeah, that's part of the storytelling value then.
Right, it's part of the storytelling value. Now, I would imagine here, because pretty much everything pre-Moses is in kind of
I remember thinking that as a kid, and that makes sense then.
Agreed, me too. And it's worth remembering that we're still in the pre-Moses era. So everything here is kind of in a very vague position with respect to historicity. So we don't know if it's just a moral tale that happens to be set in a real world political entity, or if this is an accounting of something that actually happened. We don't actually know that. And
Maybe a
even
little column A, little column B.
exactly. And so if there was a real Joseph, like an actual event that this is recounting, I imagine the dreams involved were probably somewhat vaguer and more complex than they're presented here. Now, obviously, I have no historical proof to that because you can't prove a historical thing we don't have record of. But that would be my presumption, is that if we're starting with a real event here, and this isn't just part of God's moral instruction, that the original Joseph story was just that. It was a story of a guy who interpreted some really weird dreams that are far more complicated than this here, using that kind of trans-temporal God perspective. And then all the soothsayers in Egypt were like, yeah, we know what the fuck's up with Pharaoh. And Joseph's like, I got this because God. And then it was then dumbed down for later release so that all the kiddos around the campfire, as they're wandering through 40 years of desert later on, could be like, okay, yeah, all right, I'm on board with this story. Yeah, Joseph.
Yeah.
So what
It
else do
makes
we
it,
have?
it makes the story more fun.
Yeah,
If it's like,
exactly.
oh,
Oh,
they couldn't figure it out. I
those
I know what this is gonna
soothsayers.
be.
Exactly. Like this is like you can almost see the blinking neon sign saying epic foreshadowing.
Yeah.
But I will stress this point as well. That doesn't make the story less holy or less scriptural to have these narrative elements introduced to it. Because again, and I
It's not.
cannot stress this enough, evangelicals, the whole point of this is not to be a history textbook, but to tell us the stories and moral lessons of our people. It doesn't have to be literally true in this way to serve the purpose of scripture. It's not a history book. It's not meant to work that way.
I suspect that's probably part of why, like, I know some Jewish people that don't really like Christians meddling in their texts.
Mm-hmm. Because
Like,
historically, we've been
why does this matter to you?
yeah, historically, notwithstanding how wildly anti-Semitic the Christian people have tended to be over the years, we tend to approach these scriptures without education and literally, which is not how it's meant to be. Now, the historicity of that perspective is a long conversation, but basically, around about the time of the printing press, we decided everybody can read the Bible, and pretty much every other religion looked at their scripture and said, "Fuck no! Like we need people to mediate this process. You can't just give it to all the people and say you have just as much a right to read this shit as anybody."
Yeah,
And now, of course,
that's entirely accurate. Like I've got a translation just in my randomly in my library. I was given one for free. I've got a translation of the Quran,
yeah,
but it's not the Quran, it's a translation of the Quran. It
right,
can't be labeled the Quran because it needs to be in its original language
yeah,
and it
because
needs to be
translation is
studied
interpretation.
proper. It's treated as a holy book.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I've had some conversations with a couple of imam over the years about this, and the way they put it to me is that translation is interpretation. So if you're reading an English translation of the Quran, what you're reading is a commentary. It's not
yes.
the actual scripture.
And there's
And
like an introduction that basically explains that and it stresses the importance of it and
yeah,
also takes the time to talk about
yeah,
some things that you're likely to see. Like there's a lot of very direct repetition in this.
right.
In fact, honestly, that's what I made it most difficult for me to try and get into because I really did want to try and read it.
Yeah. But
Um,
this is something that has become difficult for us as Christians is we decided centuries ago that our balance point with respect to the scripture was going to be different. We were going to treat translations as legitimate scripture rather than as simply interpretation. And we were going to allow everybody to read it. Now, for several hundred centuries or several hundred years past that point, it still worked out pretty well because people would read the scripture, but then they'd go back to their priest or pastor and say, okay, the fuck does this mean? But in the past,
and congregations would have been small enough for that to be practical.
right. But in the past 100 years or so, particularly because of American Christianity and particularly because of evangelicals, looking at you, Osteen, this
This guy sucks.
right. If you haven't seen the recently posted meme on our channel and Facebook, you should go check that out because I'm definitely borrowing from Lower Decks. I got an image of Mariner doing the thing from that season finale where she's going, "This guy sucks," pointing right at Osteen. Anyway, I digress. We've chosen a different balance point with respect to that. And that's not necessarily bad, but the last 100 years or so, we've developed this strain of anti-intellectualism in America, this belief that the individual's interpretation is as valid, if not more valid, than the educated, trained, and practiced understanding of a thing. And that has led to a situation where, combined with our Christian approach to kind of our more loosey-goosey approach to scriptural availability, we now have a situation in which there are billions of different interpretations of the Bible, and everybody seems to think they're all fucking valid. And they're not. And now the Jews are pissed because why wouldn't they be? Because half our scriptures came from them in the first place. And we're up there saying things like Moses hated the gays and stuff like that. And everybody's looking at us like we're ridiculous.
And once again, they treat their holy book as a holy
book. They treat their holy book as holy.
They're not really, you don't translate it. Like, yeah.
Like, there's a reason.
Meanwhile, getting a hold of an original language copy of the Bible is like impossible, isn't it?
Well, I mean, it's not impossible, depending on what you mean by original language. Like, I got a Hebrew Bible sitting on my desk back at home. I didn't bring it to church with me. I've got 2 more out. I got more too. I got in our library here at the church. We've got a half a dozen of the damn things. Like, they're not hard to find.
Well, you said it was originally written in an assortment of languages, though, right? Even the New
Well,
Testament?
yes. And the original, when I say Hebrew Bibles, what I mean to say is that the original text Bibles, again, original is a pretty broad definition here because we don't know how original goes. But like the original text Hebrew Bibles that are generally out there are in Hebrew and Aramaic where necessary, and with kind of interplay between languages. You get some Chaldean and a few other things that pop in from time to time. There are older scripts that we think predate the kind of assembled Hebrew Bible that are like ancient Chaldean, Paleo-Hebraic, and things like that. But those have never been in an assembled text before. But suffice it to say, like the primary assembled source language text isn't hard to find. But it is worth knowing the clear cultural difference between our Jewish siblings and ourselves is that it is a principal part of Jewish Sunday school education, for lack of a better term, to learn how to fucking read Hebrew.
Yeah, so
we don't do that. We don't do that. So none of
read your holy book in the original language. No, it makes sense. Right. Like I never really thought about it before now, but it makes sense.
It really does. Like, I can't tell you how pissed I was when I got to seminary and realized that I was so far behind all of the other religions because we didn't learn how to read our holy books when we were growing up. Like, damn it, how much easier would seminary have been if we all learned Hebrew and Greek right at the beginning?
Yeah.
Like, and there's a case to be made that our Sunday school education should be less, let's learn about Joseph and cut shit out of paper and like sing songs, and more, okay, learn your fucking Greek and Hebrew, kids. It's time to go to school. There's something to be said for that. And I'm not opposed to it. Anyway, that's my rant for today.
No, it's a really fascinating, just a fascinating thought.
Yeah, I mean,
just like, because I'm thinking about it and I'm like, yeah, don't like all other major religions keep their texts within their home language, and everything else might be a translation commentary, but is not considered the same book. Meanwhile, how many just in English, just in modern English, how many translations of the Bible are there?
Fuck, I don't even know. Like more than I can count for sure. And that, like, even the list of major translations is longer than my quote unquote arm. Like, you can't, I don't even know how many, and that's not even counting the crazy ones like fucking Schofield and his bullshit. Like, there are so many translations out there, and every other day is someone's trying to pull a Eugene Peterson to make their next Message or some shit like that.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say there's stuff like the Message where it's like that is a commentary, and it's still basic. It's treated like a Bible.
Look, I got a lot of good to say about Eugene Peterson as a theologian and as a pastoral care scholar, but that was the dumbest thing any pastoral theologian has done in forever. I'm sorry. I will never.
You really hate the Message, don't you?
I hate it. I hate it because it takes more interpretive choices than even the fucking NIV, which is terrible for that.
The NIV is like one of the most widely read versions.
Right? And it's the bullshit that gets promoted. We've gone so far away from Joseph right now that it's hilarious, but it's worth mentioning.
We can always cut this and put it in a spare video or
something. Oh, hell no. This will be the episode. This will be the episode because I got to be clear. We've pretty much covered what happened in that long ass chapter already. There's not much there.
Yeah, it doesn't ask a whole lot of questions, and the little piddly questions that it does raise,
Mhm.
like I've been raising.
Yeah. Although I will say, from a Sunday school perspective, it is worth noting when we talk about the story of Joseph in Egypt, we never mention his wife and sons. Like that never seems to come up in Sunday school. Like, dude got married, put out a couple of kiddos and everything, and that just never comes up.
And they make it a point. They say it multiple times because
Yeah.
repetition.
Hmm.
And this passage is even saying God uses repetition to get his point across,
Yeah.
or to get their point across. I like they
Mhm.
them pronouns for God. That works for me,
And this is
especially
a
because we're talking about a triune God.
right.
So
And this is a big deal, by the way. The stuff we skip over in the Bible is often the stuff that tells us points we don't want to hear from the Bible. And in the story of Joseph, we saw it in the stories of Abraham. We see it in just about every story. The point at which the main character takes a wife or a spouse from the oppressive country and brings the two cultures together to form their own new thing, assimilates a different culture into their own and becomes something new. That's always the bit we skip over in Sunday school. Like
yeah,
Joseph taking an Egyptian wife from the Egyptian hierarchy, having a relationship, having kids,
she was the daughter of a priest of a different religion.
right? Which, by the way, utter
They
side note,
mention it multiple times. I see it. They
yeah,
mention it in verse 45 and in
yeah,
verse 50. Again, repetition. That means God wants you to remember it.
right,
According to this passage, that's what that means.
right. Side note, by the way, for all you Terry Pratchett fans out there, I can't tell you how hard it is for me when I'm reading this passage to say priest of On and not priest of because oh my god, this feels so small gods to me. Anyway, so yeah, so like we do skip over those particular points whenever we're reading the damn thing. And we shouldn't. We absolutely should not. Because that's honestly, that's the lesson here is that Joseph brought the powers of God to a new place and became part of that new place. Now, the larger arc of this, of course, is setting the stage for Moses coming down the pike here, because we're wondering how did the Jews and the Hebrews get themselves settled into to Egypt in the first place? Huh? It kind of starts here. Um, so like this is setting our mosaic groundwork, but like this is the overall arc of the Bible. It starts out in a relatively good place. The connection of the Hebrews with Egypt began as God taking a terrible thing that the Hebrew boys did, the sons, Joseph's brothers there, turning it into Joseph living and thriving and prospering in the land of Egypt. And then, spoiler alert for the chapters coming ahead, brings the rest of the family into it as well. Like that is God taking a bad thing, turning it into a good thing, which then the people involved will then turn back into a bad thing later on. Like that back and forth between God redeeming and humans breaking is the whole story. And so that's the end of our episode, I guess, because I don't
Yeah,
think I
no,
have
I
anything
think
else.
that's an excellent place to end it. Honestly, I feel like we covered some interesting ground on this, considering the fact that it kind of speaks for itself.
Yeah, it really does. So that being said, my friends, my family, and various assorted everyone else who happens to be watching, including I'm sure some of my enemies, I don't know who's watching this. If you're hate watching this, I'm glad to see you too. We've
Thanks
got a
for the
lot going on.
views.
We got a lot going on here at the church, and we would love for all of you, yes, even the hate watchers, to come try to join in with us in conversation. Like our whole church, like we have a physical church, which you can see behind me, but it's in Japan, and only a handful of us are ever here because most of
Yeah.
our communities scattered around the world. So a lot of our community happenings are in our Discord server. Please come to join us there. What for talking about stuff. It's a great place to be. You may have caught me looking at my watch a few times. And that's because I'm getting alerts because people are still conversing on the Discord server
It's
as we're
busy tonight.
recording. Yeah, it is a busy night today, but people got a lot of stuff to talk about, and I'm okay with that. So we got back going on. We got our Bible study, which is every other week. We're still terrassing through Revelation, and particularly the last one before this recording was a hoot. Like everybody was coming away from that one saying, "My brain has been blown. I never imagined that Revelation was actually fucking useful." So come join us.
Dang, I'm glad I'm bummed I missed it though.
Oh yeah, It was a hoot, but you can catch the gist of it if you go back and catch the sermon from the beginning of November as well, because I kind of covered the same ground. Anyway, so we got the Bible study, we've got our worship services on the first Sunday of every month. Advent's going to be an interesting one too. We're going to be trying to pop off a whole bunch of different things. There may be some extra content. We're also getting ourselves warmed up for Christmas Eve. For those of you who are here in Japan, we're going to be having a Christmas campfire on Christmas Eve. We're going to throw up a bonfire in the yard. We're going to do s'mores, and we're going to talk about God. So why don't you, if you happen to be in Japan, come to join us? And if you don't happen to be in Japan, well, you've got about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks to save up for a plane ticket. So get on that. Or not, because I know you're all poor like me. But the one last thing I do have to ask of you, and I say I because I'm going to make someone else do it, is to do the one thing that helps us the most in producing these videos and this content, and that is
Like, share, and subscribe. Also, comment below,
yeah, all the usual internet-y stuff. It really honestly does help us a lot. The more people we can get eyes on this, the more people know they can come join us for a theologically and religiously safe place. Like, our community is open and affirming and welcoming, and I'm literally just preaching a sermon about how the gays are royalty. So like, that's what I'm working on. It's fantastic. I hope you'll enjoy it. So come join us. It's fun, I promise. And if you have any doubts about that, you can join us on the next episode of Back to Basics, and we'll see you for that in a week. So take care. See y'all then.
Bye.
Bye.